Hello, everyone. I am Belinda Cheeseborough, STEM Education Specialist at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I'm here to share the stories of African Americans and the impacts they've had and continue to have on American culture because of their STEM contributions. Through the Window and Into the Mirror is a video conversation series about the experiences of African American STEM professionals today. During this session, students will peer into the windows of their speakers' lives and learn from their lived experiences. They will also find parts of their culture and lifestyle mirrored in their stories. To everyone listening, it is our hope that you leave here with information, inspiration, and plans for action as you take your first steps towards having careers in STEM. Now, let's meet our speaker. Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein is a physicist who thinks about the fields of particle physics and cosmology. In these areas of research, she seeks to understand the smallest types of matter out there and the origin and history of the entire universe. She is originally from Los Angeles and is proud to be both Black and Jewish. Welcome, Dr. Prescod-Weinstein.
Hi.
Hi. I'm so excited to speak with you today while engaging the teachers, students, and family of students watching this interview. Now, let's move on to our first question. So please tell us about your work, what you do, and anything else you think is important for us to know.
Yeah, so I am what is called a theoretical cosmologist or a particle physicist who does theory. So let me break down kind of what the big picture is there. The big picture is that it's my job to think about the origin and evolution of space-time and everything inside of it and all of the particles, the stuff that we are made of. So one way of thinking about it is that I think about the origin story of where everything came from and where everything in space came from. I do this as a theoretical physicist. So what that means is that I don't spend very much time doing experiments or working with telescopes. I do that a little bit, but I primarily do a lot of math. So I like doing math. Not everybody feels that way about it, and you don't have to like math necessarily to do particle physics. I just happen to be one of those people who does.
I love that explanation. So we're going to start off with your childhood for a little bit and move on through different parts of your life. So starting with, did you have interest in STEM while growing up? And if so, what positive STEM experiences did you have that later inspired you to pursue a career in science?
So I really liked learning about my times tables. I actually would say that like my times tables is what this started with. And again, I don't think every physicist is someone who starts out liking math. So I don't think that that's like normal for every single person. That this just happens to be my particular journey with it. And I had a science teacher in fifth grade, an African American science teacher, who pointed out to my mom that not only did I seem to like doing math, but I also like to do I seem to be enjoying the science that we were doing and learning about how airplanes fly and that kind of thing. And so he suggested that maybe I should have some enrichment activities. So when I was 10, my mom took me to see a documentary about the famous theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking. And I was actually super annoyed about this because I wanted to watch Saturday morning cartoons, and all we could afford to do was go to a matinee. And so it was like getting up in the morning and driving across town to go see a documentary was not my idea of how to spend a Saturday morning. But halfway through the documentary, Stephen Hawking was talking about his work trying to understand what happens at the center of a black hole and how this was something that Einstein hadn't worked out. And I was like, wait, you can get paid to do math to study how the universe works? And that was really like, I was just kind of sold on that. And that was how I decided I was interested in theoretical physics. But it was really getting to see somebody else and understand that math had real world applications. It wasn't just these numbers I was writing on paper, but it could offer us predictions and descriptions of the reality around us. And that was how I was first introduced to it. And I thought that was really exciting.
That is very exciting and kind of reminds me of my similar experience with being interested in physics was through watching documentaries as well. But also that you
I
make a
love
very
that.
good point. Yeah. You make a very good point about the fact that math is not just like a paper thing. It actually informs us a lot about how the universe works, which It's all physics, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. So who were your biggest role models or influences while growing up?
I think my mom probably continues to be my biggest influence and role model. And I will say my mom, I'll just say her name, Margaret Prescod. She's not someone who feels comfortable doing math at all. And she would say, like, if she was here, she would be in the background, like nodding, big nod. Like she doesn't feel comfortable doing math. Um, but she was always really encouraging with me. And I think in a lot of ways was like very visionary. There's a type of particle called a neutrino that it's very hard for us to detect it. And when I was in high school, we weren't sure how much mass these particles had. So specifically, how much gravity they would experience, for example, here on Earth. And in high school, I was like not that interested in neutrinos. People weren't talking about it a lot in books. And so I was like, whatever, neutrinos, neutrino, whatever. And my mom was like, no, neutrinos are really cool. Neutrinos are really awesome. And it really took me 20 years to catch up with her. And I literally have a PhD in physics. So I would just say, like, my mom is like, I think she's a political organizer, but I think in another life where there was no injustice in the world, she might have been a fashion designer. And I will just say, like, I think she's very fashion forward in a bunch of ways, including in physics, it turns out. So for me, she was a really, I think, important role model of also seeing a woman who felt comfortable speaking up when she saw things that were not right and felt comfortable having opinions. And in physics, as you know, Belinda, it's very important to be comfortable forming an opinion and stating it with strength. And my mom provided an incredible example of that. I think she also provided an example for me of living life in a principled way, which meant even though I was really interested in physics and I'm very interested in math and all of those things, that I didn't forget my community commitments. And so I feel like that's a big part of my life as a scientist, is that I continue to be very engaged with thinking through issues that specifically impact Black and Brown communities. And I think that the way that she has always advised me is that I don't have to make a choice between my identity and being a scientist, that those two things can go together. And I think particularly, I'm 41 now, and particularly for people my age, we didn't have a lot of public examples of people who were doing science and also being socially engaged at the same time. And so my mom really played a key role in helping me craft what that identity might look like, because I didn't have examples of people who were like that to look up to in the sciences in the same way.
Your mom sounds like an amazing person.
She's pretty
And
boss.
yeah, this is so cool. I love how even though she doesn't have a background in science, right?
No, not at all. She's really
Yeah.
like, you didn't even want to ask her to do arithmetic by hand. She's very uncomfortable with it, right? And I think that it's a great example of it takes all kinds to be committed and interested, because it's not that she's not interested. She was clearly reading about neutrinos before I was, right?
Hmm.
And it had nothing to do with her being like, yeah, I am a super brain at math. It was just like, this is the universe, this is our cosmos, and I'm interested in our universe.
That is so awesome. I just love that she's someone who was just fascinated by something and passed on that fascination to you, but also that she really rooted you in your identity and your sense of community and helping to understand that, as you mentioned, that there is a connection between how your identity and informs your science, and how they are not separate things. They can work together.
Yeah, I think my mom was very committed. I mean, right down to, I'll just say one of my middle names is Sojourner after Sojourner Truth.
Oh,
And that was actually not my mom's idea. It was my dad's mother's idea. There's a whole story behind the various names that I got. But I will say, like, from a very young age, I was being taught Black history and being rooted in Black history. One of the first books that I remember reading by myself was a biography for children about Sojourner Truth. And so I was also getting these examples. I also had the golden era probably I'm like the old person here. Nobody else knows what the golden era comics were, but I had a golden era comic about Harriet Tubman.
Oh,
And so I was from an early age getting steeped in these stories about strong Black women who stood for what they believed in, and who were also, if you spend time learning about Sojourner Truth, she was also a very curious person who had a variety of kind of interests and a very interesting perspective on the world, a very unique perspective on the world. And so I was getting steeped in that at an early stage, and being taught that there was a lot to be proud of being part of the Black community, and being, part of the next generation of what would later be Black history. And I think that that was actually really important for me as a scientist, because it fortified me in my identity. And so when I felt like I was getting this messaging of like, oh, Black people don't do science, or Black people aren't interested in particle physics, or Black people don't do math, there are all of these stories that are just kind of floating out there. And I felt I think I was more resilient against them, because I had a strong sense of my rootedness and my community identity, and that I truly was taught from an early age that Black people can do anything. And I was also taught that we should think about whether we should be doing everything. So she was also thinking about ethics and morality and principles, and asking myself questions about, when I choose to engage in an activity, how does that sustain and support my community? Or how does that put me in a position to sustain and support my community? And so I think sometimes Black students, Brown students, Indigenous students are hesitant to choose physics, or even maybe to choose certain areas of science that aren't like what's popular right now, like computer programming, right?
mhm.
Because they think, well, how can I help my community unless I'm a doctor, or I'm doing some kind of new app that is going to revolutionize technology. And I think that my mom helped me have a lot of freedom in thinking about that question more broadly, and not feeling like there was tension between, if I want to support my community, then I can't be interested in understanding the origin and evolution of the entire universe. That I could do both, and that they could be mutually supporting. And so I was really blessed with that. And that's something that I hope students will take away, that it's not something where you have to choose one part of yourself over the other, but you can be both of those things at the same time.
I really appreciate you making that point, that it's very important that you can be multifaceted. You don't have to stay in this singular lane for yourself. So I appreciate you making that point. So what other hobbies or interests did you have while growing up aside from the STEM ones?
I think probably like the biggest one, I was a dancer. I went to a
Oh,
performing arts school for elementary school and middle school. And so I was trained primarily in modern dance. And I was also a musician. So I played flute, and then I played alto saxophone. And basically, what I really wanted to play was big band music. I was really obsessed with Duke Ellington and Count Basie. And I played alto sax all through high school. I was the band leader for my high school jazz band and first alto. So that was probably like my biggest hobby. I was also, this is probably hard for young people to appreciate, but I am, I guess the group, I'm part of the age group that came of age with the internet. So I was one of the early, thanks to my mom's political organizing, I had early access to the internet. And so I used the World Wide Web when it was first coming online for
oh
public
wow.
use. Yeah. So one of my early kind of like nerdy hobbies is I built websites on something called GeoCities that's now completely defunct. That's like probably, that's something you can find the Wikipedia page for GeoCities if you want to read more about it. But I used to like making websites, and I was just generally interested in how we used electronic communication. So I think probably those were two of my biggest hobbies. And then also I love to read, and I love literature. So as you know, Belinda, you can often see me talking on social media about books that I'm reading, books that I'm passionate about. I'm particularly passionate about Jane Austen. So you'll see me talking about Jane Austen. So the other thing is that I have never felt like, well, because I'm a scientist, I can only care about, I only read Scientific American or something like that. I'm interested in a bunch of things. I'm also very much a history nerd. Like I voluntarily took history classes in high school that were not required because I wanted to like learn more history. Um, and I would say that I think all of those interests have informed the way that I approach science and made me a better scientist. And so I think again they're mutually supporting, but they don't have to be, right? But I do think like all the music that I did, I think made me better at math. I do think it made me better at math. And it was just a really great emotional outlet for me. I'm being primarily raised in a single parent household, in a low income single parent household. We were sometimes having struggles. And I do think that the music helped me kind of get through some of the more difficult moments.
Music is literally the best thing that humanity
Yes.
could come up with. Like,
Yeah.
it's also fascinating how strong of a connection there is between music and people who do science. Because
Mm,
literally, a lot of people that I've talked to, and even myself, like I went through choir since I was little, so like singing is my biggest outlet, and I really enjoyed that.
mm.
So like seeing that connection between people who do science and do music is really beautiful.
Yeah, I've recently been trying to pick up both the flute and the saxophone again. And it's like a very humbling experience to come back to it after basically a 20-year break. But I think that those kinds of humbling experiences where you're like, this is really hard, I'm not sure that I'm ever going to be good, are in some ways a good character building experience because they're a reminder also that if you put the work in, you do get things out of it and you do improve. It's not, there's no magic trick, like nobody's born with a saxophone, like knowing all the fingerings and the embouchure and all of that. It is something that you put the work in and then you see the progress that you're making when you put the work in. And I think that's one of the reasons it helps me as a scientist is that sometimes as a scientist, you run into a problem where you get frustrated or like you don't know what you're doing or you feel like you don't know what you're doing. It's hard to see like whether you're going to move forward. And so engaging in activities that remind you that it's just a matter of putting the time in and that as you put the time in, you get to where you're going is just really helpful. It's not about being born a genius. It's about putting the work in and being persistent.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
So moving on to your undergrad/grad school, where did you go for undergrad?
So I ended up going to Harvard University. I went to college for at Harvard, and then um, at the end of college, so I was a double major in physics and astronomy, and my experience in the physics department had not been great, and I felt like I had a better experience in the astronomy department. So when I was choosing, I applied to graduate programs, which is what you do if you want to pursue a pathway in advanced science, and I thought I will be happier in an astronomy department because I felt like it would be better culturally. And so initially I entered a graduate program, a PhD program in astronomy. And I got as far as like passing my exams that we have to do after the first 2 years and was making progress towards my PhD. And I just realized I was taking a lot of physics classes. And I was spending most of my time over in the physics department. My primary advisor was over in the physics department, but I wasn't happy with some of the research choices that I had there. And so I actually ended up transferring to a PhD program in theoretical physics. And
Oh,
so I went from a PhD program in astronomy at UC Santa Cruz, where I eventually earned a master's degree. And then I moved on to a PhD in theoretical physics at the University of Waterloo, and doing my research at the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics in Canada, which is my first time I actually had never been to Canada until my first time visiting the Perimeter
oh
Institute.
wow.
Yeah.
What was it like living in Canada versus like living in the US? What did it really feel any different?
You know, it was such an interesting learning experience for me. So as a kid coming from a multinational family, my mom's from Barbados. My dad is American, but mostly grew up in Trinidad and England. And so I had spent a lot of time mostly in England growing up, but also time in Barbados. And so I felt comfortable with like international travel. I was very lucky in that respect. But I had definitely bought, I think a lot of the stories we get told about Canadians in the US is that Canada is basically like the US, but like they're nicer and they say a boot, right?
Yeah.
That was like I watched Degrassi and that was pretty much like all I knew about Canada. And so it was interesting actually going there, coming in with those stereotypes and learning about the cultural differences and even about, I think we're given kind of this propaganda that there was less racism in Canada. And
Yeah.
the way that I like to say it now is that there's six on one and half dozen on the other, which is to say that they look different, but they're basically the same. The kind of racism that I dealt with in Canada was different from the kind of racism that I had experienced in the United States, but it was not that there was no racism.
Hmm.
Um, and so these were things that I had to kind of be socialized into. Like I had to learn what it meant to be Black in a Canadian context. I think for me, it was an extraordinarily enriching experience because I did learn a lot about Black Canadian history and Black Canadian literature while I was there. And that was an incredible experience that I now feel for me, that's one of my communities because I was an immigrant there. That it broadened my sense of who my community is and who my people are. I think that was one of the things I got out of that experience. The other thing is because I grew up in Los Angeles, where there isn't a big identifiable Black Caribbean community the way there is, like my mom's family is mostly in Brooklyn, right? And so
Hmm.
Brooklyn is like everybody knows there's a huge Caribbean community there. I think living near Toronto, which is where I was, that was my first time actually living in a place where um, I had regular access to a Caribbean community, a very established Caribbean community, and had a car, right? So in Boston, we also have a large Caribbean community, but I didn't have a car, and I was just kind of in my college bubble when I was in college. So
Hmm.
this was really my first time kind of having that experience of not just being Black American, but also being Black Caribbean in a community way outside of my family context. And so for me, I think that was really powerful. But I do think like the racism was difficult to deal with. And so I there was an element of I was happy to come home to places where I understood the patterns more and felt like they were easier to navigate. So it was also challenging.
I Racism is never easy to deal with.
Right.
So yeah, I can understand that. It's also interesting that you were talking about like mentioning the Black Caribbean community because I think a lot of people just think about the Black community as just a monolith,
Mm.
but it's a diaspora, right? And so you have these pockets of people who have different experiences. Like the Black American experience is very different from like the Black Caribbean experience, and also like when they come and immigrate here. So I appreciate you talking about like that community specifically. Um, I forgot to ask this question earlier, but what made you want to continue on to grad school versus just stopping at undergrad?
That was already my plan. So, like,
Okay.
after I saw that documentary about Stephen Hawking, I actually, as I mentioned, I had early access to the World Wide Web. I found Stephen Hawking's website with his email address, and I sent an email to him when I was like 11 and said, "How do I become a theoretical physicist?"
Oh my gosh. Did he respond?
And one of his graduate students responded, which like you will now appreciate. It's like, should the graduate student have been tasked with replying to these kinds of emails? I don't know. Like I am, but one of his graduate students responded, and I wish to God I knew this person's name. I really wish I knew this person's name because I'd love to find them and thank them. And they said, you have to go to a top university, which we could talk about. I don't think you have to go to a top university, but you have to go to college, right?
Mhm.
And then he said, after you go to college, you get a PhD. And after you get a PhD, you become a professor, and that's how you become a theoretical physicist. And so I made a plan. I was like, all right, what are the top universities that have really good financial aid? Because my parents are not paying for me to go to college. And so I figured out, again, using websites very early, this is like 1994, just to put kind of like a timeline on it. I figured out that Harvard and Caltech, California Institute of Technology, were both places that were considered to be very good and also had good financial aid. And then I basically made a plan. I was like, these are the grades I have to get. And I want to emphasize this is one pathway. There are other people who take completely different pathways. Like I have one friend who works in planetary protection, planetary defense, where they are, watching for asteroids and comets. We actually do have people who like do that. And she went through community college first, right? So she had a completely different pathway. She didn't think she was going to do physics or astronomy initially. So my pathway is just one, but that was the approach that I took, because I was totally like, as the adults would say, a type A personality. You just like plan the whole thing out. And I think at the point where I was starting to think about finishing up my degree, being a working class student in a place like Harvard, I was surrounded by people who were like, I don't know what I'm going to do next. I'm just going to move home and think about it for a while. And my family didn't have that kind of money for me to be like, all right, I'm going home. Let me just chill for a while. Like I had to take care of myself. And so I think for me, that was one of the things I was thinking about, is like what allows me to kind of maintain my independence and not create financial difficulty for my family. That was one thing. And so grad school was that pathway for me in one way. The other thing is that I didn't want to do work for the military. And that was what a lot of people who were studying STEM were doing if they stopped at an undergraduate degree, particularly in physics. I think there's more breadth now, but it was basically that or become a high school teacher. And I did not feel ready to be in charge of a classroom of young people. It's such a huge responsibility. And it's a kind of competency that I didn't think I had. I didn't think that I would be good at it.
Mm,
And so on the one hand, I had a plan that this is what I wanted to do. But on the other hand, I also think given the other options, for me, that was the best choice. I do think there are people who take time off after college and they find a job that maybe has nothing to do with science, and they work that for a couple of years, and it gives them time to get themselves ready psychologically or financially for graduate school. And I actually think that that is a great way to approach things as well. It just wasn't the one that was right for me, but I think it's a fantastic approach, and you don't have to go right into graduate school.
yes, exactly. Let's see. So you mentioned that you initially went into an astronomy program, but you decided that you didn't want to continue on because you weren't interested in those research areas that were available. So you transferred into a theoretical physics PhD program. So what did you study for your research in that program?
Yeah, so I was very focused on cosmology during throughout the entire thing. I will say I
Mm,
was just very focused on cosmology. This is an interesting kind of it can be hard to explain to people who don't actually work in the field, adult or kid. But there are cultural differences between physics and astronomy, which is interesting because they're basically the same fields. Like astronomy is basically a subfield of physics, but there are definitely people who would get mad if they heard me say that.
yeah.
As you know, this is something that really causes, people tend to think of scientists as like not emotional, but scientists are some of the most emotional people that you will run across on the entire planet. Deeply emotional people, I would say. And how people feel about that divide is interesting. And so I found myself in a situation. What's interesting and exciting about cosmology, which again is understanding the origin and evolution of the universe and everything inside of it, is that it requires drawing from a lot of different parts of physics and astronomy in order to put the pieces together. And so you have to have knowledge about particle physics, you have to have knowledge about astrophysics, like the structure of galaxies. You have to have knowledge about stellar astrophysics, so understanding how stars work. You need to bring all of those pieces together in order to do cosmology. And so I found myself in a situation where I was taking all of the core classes in the astronomy department and in the physics department because I wanted to have that breadth so that I could put all the pieces together in my cosmology research. So the person I worked with at Santa Cruz was Anthony Aguirre, who is also a theoretical cosmologist. Lovely. I think leaving Anthony was the hardest thing about leaving Santa Cruz. But it became clear to me that the astronomy department at Santa Cruz did not feel comfortable with the amount of physics that I was doing. And that became a source of tension, which is one of the reasons that I left the program. It's funny because people often assume I left the program because I failed my exams, and that's not what happened at all. I passed them. It's one of those cultural things where people see that you didn't stay in one program and they assume that you got kicked out. But I actually chose to leave them. And one of the reasons that I left was one that I wasn't feeling like I had the support that I should get, the intellectual support that I should get in the astronomy department. But the other piece of it was I got really interested in something called quantum gravity.
Ooh.
And I wanted to pursue it. And this other program in Canada actually gave me a better option to do that. So I guess I should say what quantum gravity is. So in physics, we have a theory that describes the universe when things are moving very fast, like close to the speed of light. And this is relativity. And this also describes things when there's very strong gravity, like a black hole or a neutron star. And actually, Belinda is much more of an expert on that than I am. I will just put that out there. So that is called the realm of relativity. We also have a theory that describes things when they're very, very small, like the smallest stuff out there. And that is the quantum world. And so you would think, well, it's one universe, somehow it all has to work together. But we actually do not have a functional theory of quantum gravity that merges the two realms and the two ways of thought together. And you will hear people describe this as like a holy grail in physics to understand quantum gravity. And I think a lot of students get really excited about quantum gravity. I don't know if maybe for you, Belinda, this was a motivating question at some point. But for me, I wanted to do quantum gravity. And so when I went to the program and started doing research at Perimeter Institute, my research was very focused on specifically thinking about how quantum gravity could help us explain what at the time was a fairly new problem in cosmology, which was that we knew space-time was expanding. So space-time is literally expanding between galaxies. So if you have two galaxies like this, and they're, think about them as the distance between my earrings, that eventually the galaxies are going to be at this distance. And it's really the best way to give this example is if I took off my earrings and they kept going. Mm-hmm. And really the space between them is expanding. So you can think about it like when you're baking a cake with like some raisins in it, and the cake expands between the raisins as it bakes. So we knew space-time was expanding. Towards the end of my time in high school, it was realized that expansion was accelerating. So it was picking up speed. And I think there's still an open question there as to what causes it. But when I was in graduate school, I was really obsessed with the idea that quantum gravity might help us explain it.
That actually leads me into my next question. What were the best and most challenging parts of your grad school experience?
Ooh, it's an interesting question to answer now because, like in hindsight, I think one of the best experiences was actually the friends that I made. Mm-hmm. I'm still close with a couple of my roommates from graduate school. And one of my office mates, I just celebrated my 10-year wedding anniversary, and one of my office mates was part of the wedding. And so I do think there was an element of it that was just the community that I got out of it, which I realized doesn't answer the question scientifically at all. But I do think, when it's not like you go to graduate school and you stop being a person and all you are is a brain. You're a person having a whole life. And so actually at various points, I had a lot of fun in graduate school. I think it's probably hard for people to imagine now, but my house was the party house when I lived in Santa Cruz. And my roommate Candace and I were the ones who organized all the parties. So it wasn't just that my house was the party house, but I was the party organizer. So we do have like a real like life beyond just doing calculations. Um, I think maybe the most amazing thing about graduate school for me was actually getting to learn all of these fancy calculational tools that describe particle physics, and not just to say, oh, the universe is expanding, but to actually be able to show that with an equation and to know that equation and to learn how to manipulate it and work with it. And so you do kind of have this moment of always feeling like a puppet master. You're like, oh, like I have these equations. Now I can kind of control like what the universe might be like, only on paper, right? You're not actually changing things in the real world.
Yeah.
But when you stop and think about it, that's pretty wild. It's pretty cool, right? So I think that that was the coolest part of being in graduate school. I do think one of the hardest things about being in graduate school, and I'm sure this is one that you're familiar with as well, was I was often the only woman in the class. And I was always the only Black student in the class. And I was often one of the only students of color in the class and the only woman of color in the class. And I didn't always feel like I fit in culturally in terms of just like even the kind of music that I was raised listening to, right? It felt like sometimes like we were from different planets. um, and I guess like maybe the example I will give is when I was living in Waterloo in Canada. At the time, Waterloo was a smallish town. It's grown a lot over the last decade, but it was a relatively smallish town. It was still surrounded by farmland, and it was about 70 miles from Toronto. So it wasn't like a big urban area. And I had never lived somewhere where I had really had to think about how hard it would be to get a haircut. Like I didn't think about it. So you can see like I have curly hair. And so it came time I realized like I needed a haircut, and I did not know how to find a salon that knew where people knew how to cut hair like mine. And so I started going into all the salons in downtown and just saying like, do you cut hair like mine? And people said like really like ridiculous. Like one person looked at my hair and was like, can I even put a comb in that? And that kind of like, yeah, which is
Wow.
like, I
Cool.
have type 3 hair. It's curly, but like, it's not as curly as it could be. I mean, it was just like, people were wild. Um, and so eventually, and this is also, I think, like a beautiful story about the Black community. There were not a lot of Black people in Waterloo. There were a lot in Toronto, but I didn't know Toronto yet at that point. So I found someone, I like using Google or something, I found someone in the area who did braids. And,
Mm,
usually braiders are not hairstylists, right? But I
yeah.
was desperate. So I called her and was like, do you by any chance cut hair? Do you by any chance cut Black hair? And she was like, I don't, but there's a pair of sisters, a pair of Jamaican sisters who do cut hair, but I don't know their names or their phone number or where they are. But if you go to the Jamaican stall in the market, the woman at the Jamaican stall in the market will be able to tell you. So it was this kind of like Black folks sending me from one person to one person. So I went to the stall in the market, which it turned out made amazing ginger beer. I still miss that ginger beer. It was so good.
Oh, I love ginger beer. Oh
It
man.
was like she made it herself. It was not the canned stuff. It was not ginger ale. It was real, like the strong
Ooh.
ginger beer. Yes. And she gave me the number of the sisters, and I called them and eventually got my hair cut. But it was really these Black women who didn't know me were just like helping me like get the hookup and telling me where to go. But that I think that that's an example of the way in which it can be hard, which is as a scientist, you're expected to just go where the opportunities are.
Mhm.
and to move to wherever is the best place for your academic work. And that is not always the best place for you culturally, or it's not always immediately obvious where the people who you feel culturally connected to are going to be. And the physicists are not always good at connecting you with those people. There was nobody in the building at the Institute for Theoretical Physics where I could be like, hey, do you know where I could find someone that does hair like mine? Like, nobody in the building knew the answer to that question. I was the only Black person who worked in the building. So I think that's an example of the ways in which it was hard. And I think that's an example of like the way that the racism can be systemic. It's not
Mhm.
necessarily about people saying mean things, although that comment about can I put a comb through that, I'm going to remember that one for the rest of my life, right? There were other ones, but that's the one that really stands out to me. But it's also how it's systemic, that like that it hadn't occurred to them to have that information available for me either.
You bring up a very important point. Something I also didn't consider when I went to WVU, but just the fact that you're not just going to school to do research or to study, you are basically moving into an area and you have to consider all parts of your life, social, mental, everything. Like you have to consider all of those parts of your life when you move somewhere. So that's like regardless of
Mhm.
undergrad, I feel like it's easier with undergrad, but especially if you're going to grad school, you have to consider that those aspects of your life so that you can actually prosper and thrive in that environment.
I think as scientists, we're not necessarily encouraged to do that, particularly as students, because the traditional advising and mentoring system is built around one type of student,
Mhm.
a white man from a middle class background. And a white man who's able-bodied, right? Who doesn't
Yeah.
have concerns about like, is this campus accessible for me as a wheelchair user or as someone who can't walk long distances, right? Um, and so the system is really organized around the idea that that person will find people like them anywhere they go because they're culturally dominant. And certainly when people were advising me about where to apply for graduate school or how to make my graduate school choices, I didn't have anyone who was like, I also got into the University of Maryland Department of Astronomy, and I probably would have had an easier time culturally in the DC area than even living in Santa Cruz, which Santa Cruz is very white, but I also, being from California, I knew how to navigate the Bay Area, and so it was less stressful for me, right?
Mhm.
But they weren't even asking themselves those questions of like, does she know how to navigate Santa Cruz? Will she be able to afford a car that will give her some transportational freedom? And I got really lucky that my stepfather helped me out with a car. That made a huge difference in all of these stories. Because how did I even get to the market to go to the Jamaican stall? I drove there, right? And so there are these questions of socioeconomic background that come into play, in addition to your racial identity and cultural needs. Um, I also, for a long time, like Waterloo did not have the kinds of Jewish options that I needed as a Jewish person. And for me, that was at the time was less salient than finding my Black community connections and my Black community space. But it was something that I lost out on, and it's a period of time in your life. So, so this might sound kind of like disheartening, right? But I think one of the things that's shifting is that we now have people like, I'm now a professor. I didn't have professors like me. And so there are more people like me who think to have those conversations with students. And so I hope that at least sometimes students are having a better experience with being able to make those choices in an informed way. And we also have fantastic people like you who are in these positions of like museum education, that make it so that people have access to information, because I think the big thing was that we just didn't have the information,
Mhm.
and we didn't have people saying these are the questions you should ask yourself. So that's not to say you shouldn't go to Waterloo or you shouldn't go to West Virginia, right? But it's
Mhm.
like you need to ask yourself, is the space right for me? How can I find a space that's right for me? And I think that we just weren't given the same level of equipment that we should have been.
Exactly. That actually leads me to my next question. So you mentioned that you pursued being a professor because that was the goal all along, as what that graduate student told you to do to become a theoretical physicist. Um, So now that you are an associate professor at the University of New Hampshire, right?
Yes.
Yes. What are your responsibilities as an associate professor? And also congratulations on tenure.
Thank you. Um, yeah, this is interesting because this was definitely not in the student's email of like what a professor's life actually is like, right?
Yeah.
So I think sometimes people imagine that professors are just sitting in front of chalkboards, like writing equations, and then also that we occasionally teach a class. But actually I spend a lot of my time like doing paperwork. And some of that actually has to do with like, states don't properly fund public education. I know this is a really big fight. As we're recording this, there's a huge fight going on at West Virginia University around this right now.
Yeah.
And that's maybe the most famous and publicly known one, but that fight is happening at every public institution. And so we have less support as time goes on to do our jobs. And that means that basically I wear lots of hats. So I am a teacher. I'm teaching this fall, I'm teaching Introduction to Stellar Astrophysics for advanced undergraduates and for starting graduate students. I love teaching this class. So stellar astrophysics is such a cool topic. It's so weird how much I love this, even though I don't do research on it. Stars are where everything that we are made of comes from, basically, except for the hydrogen. So it's just like, they're pretty boss, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing I'm doing. I have to completely prepare the course myself. I'm also the grader for the course. I don't have a TA, so I'll be doing all of the grading. I don't have someone that I can just be like, you know what, I don't feel like teaching today. Graduate student, you teach it instead. I'm not that kind of professor. So I do also have a research group that I'm responsible for, where I'm leading us through various research projects where we're asking questions that nobody knows the answer to, and we're attempting to answer those questions. That's really what we do in research. And that research group includes a postdoctoral fellow. So that's someone who has their PhD and is preparing to apply for faculty positions. And actually, my postdoctoral fellow in my group is going to be doing that this fall. Um, yeah, and Nathan, his name's Nathan Musoki. He's been fantastic to work with, and also unexpectedly, he's Afro-Canadian, and so there's been
Oh,
this unexpected having that cultural connection within the group as well. I also have two graduate students working with me. One just finished his PhD, so I had three, now I have two. So I have a research team of at least three people working with me. We also all collaborate with people at other institutions. So the big thing here is that research is very social in science. I think there can be this stereotype that like scientists are loners, but actually scientists are the social people in academia. So I'm responsible for managing how everybody's doing, checking in, making sure they're making progress on their projects, making progress on their PhDs, chairing their PhD committee. And then I also have to do service to my department and to my community. So I'm currently sitting on a committee appointed by the National Academy of Sciences called
wow.
Elementary Particles, Progress, and Promise. And this committee is tasked with developing a vision for what particle physics will be 30 to 50 years from now. So big picture, the future of my field. And that I'm actually not allowed to say very much in public about what's going on in that committee. But I'm the youngest person, I think, by about 10 years on the committee. And when I was still not tenured, I was the only untenured person. So it's been interesting being kind of the baby on the committee. And, that's just a piece of what I do. I guess I didn't even talk about being a writer.
Oh, I'm gonna ask that question.
Okay. So I'm also writing books. And so I wear a lot of different hats. And I think the things that I've named are the things that I do that lots of other physicists do. Most physicists don't write books. And so that's different. But I am a monthly columnist for New Scientist. And so that's part of the array of responsibilities I have. And then there's a bunch of service busy work that we just won't talk about, but it takes up a lot of hours in my day.
Yep. So you would say that your typical week is just basically switching from one hat to the other, even several times throughout the day?
Yeah, I will say that this is a great job if you're someone who likes variety. You're going to get a ton of variety. You're rarely going to have 4 or 5 hours where you can just focus on one thing. You're going to be like, all right, I have a meeting now. I have a free hour to do some calculations or some reading. Then I have another meeting. Then I'm checking in with my graduate student. I think the other thing that I didn't realize when I was more early career as a graduate student and as a postdoc is that when you're a professor, you're doing a lot less of the calculating, and a lot of your responsibility is mentoring the people who are doing the calculating because you actually don't have the time. And you're actually relying a lot on your graduate students, you're relying a lot on your postdoc. And I wish more faculty would support graduate students having better salaries for that reason, because the work doesn't get done without them, right?
Mhm.
Um, but I think that that was something that I wasn't entirely prepared for, which is when you become a professor, you really do move into being kind of a manager. And sometimes I'm jealous. I'm like, I wish I had that kind of free time to just sit and calculate. It's a weird thing. Like I sometimes I want to go back to the time when I was a postdoc and be like, enjoy this because like you can just go to a conference whenever you feel like it. Like, is the conference in the middle of October for 2 weeks? That's fine. Just go. Whereas like now, if I get invited to go somewhere for a day, I'm like, I can't do that. I have to miss class. It's too much trouble.
Mhm.
And at the university level, you don't get substitute teachers. So like, it's not like the school will call someone and be like, teach Chanda's class. Like I have to find someone to do it for me. Um, and it can negatively affect your teaching evaluations. And when you don't have tenure, that becomes important. And so you have in practice, you get paid more as a professor, but you have a lot less freedom than graduate students and postdocs do, which is like a very interesting kind of transition to go through. You're like, I'm finally financially free, but suddenly temporally not at all. Like,
I feel like that's the case for like a lot of people, no matter what career. It's kind of like having the freedom in your childhood, and you go through, and
yes,
as you get older, you get more responsibilities and less freedom
yes.
to do the things you enjoyed when you were a child.
Yes. Yes. And so I do think like, that I exactly you have to really commit to making that time and finding that time. And so actually that's been one of my big projects for the last summer is trying to reorganize myself so that I can have more of the things that I enjoy and maybe do less of a good job on the things that I don't enjoy.
So you mentioned that you are an author, you're a writer. So what is the title of your book and what is it about?
So I have so far published one book. It's called The Disordered Cosmos: A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred. And I how would I describe this book? So this book I would say is like a holistic look at the doing of particle physics and cosmology. And so not just the actual science, which it opens with the Big Bang and where everything comes from. But it also talks about the social issues and some of the things that we have discussed in this conversation about the challenges that people face in trying to get the science done, whether it's not having enough administrative support or it's sexism or it's racism. So that's what the Disordered Cosmos was about. Um, the I'm now working on a second book that's called The Edge of Space-Time.
Ooh.
And this one is really going to be a look at what makes questions about space-time so thrilling and compelling. And what does it mean to look at space-time from the margins and from the edges? So there's going to be a lot of really fun quantum mechanics in the book. There's going to be black holes. I actually probably should look at some of your papers to get inspiration for some of those discussions. So I'm currently working on that. It'll be a couple of years before it comes out. And then I have a third book that actually hasn't been publicly announced yet. So I won't say too much about where it's going to be published or when, but I am working on an academic book. So this one's going through peer review called The Cosmos is a Black Aesthetic. This is actually the first time I'm saying that
Ooh.
in public.
Ooh.
Um, and it has been accepted for publication somewhere. So I'm really excited about that too.
I'm looking forward to when these newer books are gonna come out. Those sound amazing. So we have a few minutes left, but I have a few questions left. So
Sure.
one question I wanna ask, is you've talked extensively throughout our conversation about your Black identity and finding community within the Black community, also within, like, the Black Caribbean community as well. Um, but there's also other parts of your identity, like, for instance, in other conversations you've had, you talked about your Jewish identity and also being a queer person as well. So how do those identities shape your everyday experiences?
I will say when I went to Waterloo, one of the ways that I found community was through the queer community. And so sometimes it was literally just like trying to find people who understood like not being part of the mainstream. And sometimes like that ended up being the first people I found were the white queer people. It was mostly white queer people. Um, and so that was a feature. There definitely was homophobia that I experienced in the community. When I was in graduate school, my ex-wife and I were married and I had to deal with how people responded to that. Um, so that was certainly a feature. It also, again, gave me activities because when Pride rolls around, we're like having fun.
Mhm.
I'm just like when a crop over rolls around, we're like having fun. Other people aren't having that kind of fun. Um, and then for me as a Jewish person, I think that I look to I think I would say safely describe myself as an atheist, but I look to the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as my grounding place when I have questions about ethics and directions that I should go in. And so I do feel like um my Jewishness has been guiding for me in that way. And I think it also gives me a lot of insight into how dominant Christianity is in the United States, which you know, speaking of challenges of finding teachers, I have to on the Day of Atonement, I am not supposed to be working. I'm supposed to be in temple. And that means that like every September, October, I have to find someone to teach my class during Yom Kippur. There's no mechanism at the university for that because the only religious holidays that the university actually respects are Christian ones.
Wow.
And so I have a different experience as a Jewish person because it puts more work on me in terms of making sure that students don't see me in a negative light because I missed class. And that doesn't happen to my colleagues who are not observant Jews.
So my final two questions, the first being, what does Black/African American representation in STEM mean to you? We can also add Jewish and also queer representation as
Yeah.
well.
Um, I think representation is really powerful, and I also think it's limited, right? And so we have to be really careful about um, when I became a professor. It was a huge moment for me and a huge moment, I think, for my mom and for my family. It also did not change conditions in the community where I grew up. I grew up in a working class, primarily Latinx, Mexican American community. And at the point when I became a professor, ICE was arresting a lot of people and deporting
Mm.
them. And me becoming a professor did not change those conditions for those members of my community. And so the representation of me in physics didn't change things politically. On the other hand, as we were talking about earlier, having people who have the competency to attend to our cultural needs within our discipline is powerful and is meaningful. And I do feel like I'm able to provide that to the Black students who cross my path, which is to mentor them from a place of awareness of the kinds of questions that they might be asking themselves. And I don't know if that's just representation, because that's also the work that I'm doing, but I do think that there's an element of like, I represent one way of being Black and STEM, as Dr. Stephanie Page first put it. I represent a pathway of being Black and STEM, and that gives people a model to work with. It doesn't mean that they will do the exact same thing, but it means that they have an awareness of at least yet another choice that's available to them.
That actually leads me into my final question of what advice do you have for members of our audience, particularly the middle schoolers and high schoolers that want to follow a similar path as you?
The most important characteristic of a physicist is persistence. So that means that sometimes things are going to be hard. Sometimes you are going to get knocked over, or you're going to feel like that problem knocked the wind right out of me. And you have to dust your shoulders off and get back up again and come at it again. And that's actually the most important quality that probably a scientist in any field can have. I know that sometimes people think that like it's a question of are you a genius or not? But I really encourage students to have a flexible intelligence mindset. If you put the work in, you will get things out of it. Even though I know that dealing with racism, dealing with sexism, dealing with transphobia and ableism, all of those things are out there, and students are going to have to face those things. And we don't always have the power to just be like, I'm going to overcome. I think that students can tell that we're not being honest when we act like it's that easy. But the things that are within your control is you can do your work. So do your work. And to the extent that you can do it and not let people stop you from doing it, do your work and trust that you have the competency, the ability that if you put the work in, you will get stuff out of it.
Well, Dr. Prescod-Weinstein, thank you for your time, for sharing your story with us, and for giving us insight into the wonderful world of physics and everything that you have to offer. To everyone watching, thank you for spending your time with the National Museum of African American History and Cultures Through the Window and Into the Mirror, a career conversation series. Thank you all for your participation, and please remember, history is made by doing ordinary tasks extraordinarily well over long periods of time. Before you sign off, please take time to complete an evaluation form for this interview session. The link to the evaluation form is posted in the chat. If you have time, please take 2 minutes and fill it out. Thank you very much. Stay safe and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you so much.